It's that time again. It's the podcast that takes your personal and professional life to a whole new level. Whether you're selling a product, selling a service, or selling yourself, one thing is for sure. You're always selling for life. Welcome to another installment of the Selling for Life podcast, sponsored by Coddled Parts, a world of parts with a personal touch. This podcast is about more than just selling stuff, more than just about selling yourself. We think if you stick around, you will get a lot out of it. I'm your host, Steve. I'm going to tell you a quick story here. Sort of embarrassing, but when I was a freshman in high school in Buffalo, New York, I became good friends with a girl in my neighborhood. Her name was Carrie. And that friendship grew, and soon I was absolutely head over heels for this girl. I would say that she was like my first love. Every day after school, we would hang out. It was really innocent. We went to just movies in the park. It was really awesome. But 3 months later, my father came home and dropped a bomb on me. He said we were moving to Florida, and I was absolutely devastated. You know, a 15-year-old kid. I had what I thought was the love of my life, and I was moving away from her. Well, moving day came, and it was about mid-July, and my heart was just truly broken. And soon after arriving in the Sunshine State, I was on a mission. I was going to get back up to Buffalo for Christmas to be with Carrie. I was truly motivated. I went out and I got a job washing dishes at a restaurant. I wasn't legally old enough to have a job, so I lied on my application and I convinced the manager of the restaurant that I really was old enough. And I have a feeling he kind of knew I wasn't, but, you know, he saw I was motivated, so he let me have the job. And I worked the dinner shift after school to save up money for a plane ticket. And back then, minimum wage was about $3 an hour. And a plane ticket back then wasn't cheap. It was about $300. At home, I had a calendar that helped me count down the days. And I also kept track of what I was making towards my financial goal. Well, Christmas Day came, and I flew out. Yes, I flew out on Christmas Day. Unfortunately, this story doesn't have a romantic storybook ending. The love of my life, Carrie, she was by then interested in another kid, and I was very depressed. But, you know, a broken heart mends for sure. 35 years later, I'm just fine. Kinda. And that brings us to the topic of the day, and the topic of the day is motivation. Listen, motivation is at the center of anything that requires hard work. The more motivation you have, the better your chances at success. You can be motivated to make more money, motivated to be in better shape, motivated to achieve recognition. But there's really no greater motivation than the motivation of love. We are all motivated by something. Truly the best thing to be motivated by, though, is love. Not for yourself, but for someone else. I personally know people who sacrifice a ton for the love that they have for others. They give up their time, their money, their comfort zones to serve others, and often they are virtually trapped in a world that is very unpleasant, but they persevere because they know that the reward at the end of the line will be worth it. And they may not see light at the end of the tunnel, but they have faith that what they're doing and the things that they're working towards will be good, not just for them, and in many cases not for them, but for the ones that they love. For this installment of the Selling for Life podcast, I'm turning to Zig Ziglar. He has got a remarkable story about one such family.
In early 1965, I was in Kansas City where I was addressing my first really major seminar. When the seminar was over, I headed back to my room expecting to have a lonely dinner that evening. But as I stepped off the elevator, the booming voice of a man I've come to know and love as a brother sounded out, "Zig, where are you going?" And I said, "Well, I'm going to dinner." He said, "Wait a minute." He said, "I'll go with you." It was David Lofchik from Winnipeg, Canada. When we sat down, you have seen it happen where men just become instant friends. And I don't mean just buddies, I mean really close friends. We had about the same size families. His daddy died when he was very young. My daddy died when I was very young. He'd gone to work very early. I'd gone to work very early. He had gotten in the cookware business. I'd gotten in the cookware business. I mean, it was just an amazing thing. We sat down for dinner, and I said, "Bernie, you've certainly come a long way to a sales meeting." He said, "Yeah, you know, it really was magnificent. I got some wonderful ideas." Said it really was a great experience. Well, I kind of persisted, you know. I was going to find something negative to say there. So I said, "Yeah, but it sure cost you a lot of money to come from Winnipeg, Canada, down to Kansas City for a couple of days." Well, he said, "You know, Zig, thanks to my son David, I don't really have to worry about money." I said, "Bernie, that sounds like a story. Would you share it with me?" He said, "Yes, I will." He said, "When our son David was born, our joy literally knew no bounds. We were elated. We already had our 2 girls. Now we had the boy. That's the family we wanted when we got married." But he said, it wasn't but a few days before we realized something was wrong. David's head hung too limply to the right side of his body. He drooled too much to be a normally healthy baby. But the doctor said, "Don't worry about it, he'll outgrow it." But you know, Zig, Bernie said, when it's your baby, you worry about it. We took him to a specialist, and the specialist, this was after about 6 months, the specialist, incredibly enough, diagnosed him with a condition he identified as the reverse of club's feet, and treated him for that for several weeks. But Bernie said, "You know, Zig, we knew it was more serious than that." So we went to another specialist. And this specialist, after a very exhaustive examination, told us, said, "This little boy is a spastic. He has cerebral palsy. He's never going to be able to walk or talk or count to 10. I'm going to suggest that you put him in an institution for his own good and for the good of the, quote, normal members of the family." But Bernie looked at me, and with those dark eyes of his flashed, and he said, "Zig," but he said, "You know, I'm not a buyer. I'm a seller. I could not conceive of my son living the life of a vegetable and growing up to be absolutely a nothing. I saw him in a different light altogether." So I asked the doctor if he knew of any other doctors, and this specialist got highly indignant. He stood up. He said, "I've given you the best advice you'll ever get. I suggest that you take it." And the interview was over. Bernie Lofchik didn't take it. He went to another specialist who told him the same thing, and then another and another and another and yet another. 30 different specialists said, "There is no hope for this little boy." Then they heard of a Dr. Perlstein from Chicago, Illinois. Dr. Perlstein was reputedly the #1 authority in the world on cerebral palsy. But he was so busy that he was booked for 2 full years in advance. Bernie finally got his home phone, called him there, made an arrangement so that if there was a cancellation, that David would have the first alternate. Just 11 days later, a little boy from Australia canceled, and they bundled David up, flew him to Chicago for the examination. It was probably the most comprehensive physical that any child has been given up until that point. I mean, they really spent hour after hour after hour going over the baby. They threw out all of the other findings, all of the other x-rays. They just started from ground zero and went on with the examination. They called in the best expert in the world to read the x-rays, just to tell them what was there, to make no diagnosis, to make no recommendations, just tell me what you see in the x-ray. When it was all over, Dr. Perlstein and his nurses sat down with the Lofchiks, and they said, "This little boy is a spastic. He has cerebral palsy. He's never going to be able to walk or talk or count to 10. If you listen to the prophets of doom." But he said, I happen to be solution conscious, not problem conscious. I believe there's something which you can do for this little boy if you are willing to do your part. The Lofchiks rather obviously said, well, doctor, you tell us, we will do anything that is humanly possible. Now, at that time, they could not easily afford a very heavy financial burden. But they said, spell it out, doctor, and we'll do what is necessary. And in minute detail, he said, you're going to have to work this little boy beyond all human endurance. Then you're going to have to work him some more. You will have to push him until he literally falls, and then you're going to have to pick him up, and you'll have to push him some more. You're going to have to be patience personified, because there will be many, many months where you will be unable to detect any progress at all. But if you ever stop, he will go all the way back, and then you will have to start all over. You're going to have to understand this is a lifetime commitment you're making, not something you do this year, next year, 5 years, or whatever. This is from now on. Well, the Lofchiks took David and they went home. They hired a physical fitness expert and a bodybuilder. They built a little gymnasium in the basement of their home and they went to work. It took a number of months before David could even move the length of his own body. One day, many months, probably about 2 to 3 years later, Bernie received a call from the therapist. He said, I believe David is ready. Come on home. Bernie Lofchik rushed home. David was down in the gymnasium on a mat getting ready to do a push-up. And as that little body started to rise into the air, the physical and emotional exertion was so great, there was not a dry inch of skin on that little body. The mat looked as if you had sprinkled water on it. When that one perfect push-up was complete, Mom and Dad, the 2 sisters, David, the therapist, and several of the neighbors who were over there broke down and shed the tears which clearly say that happiness is not pleasure. Happiness is victory. The story is even more remarkable when we learn that one of America's leading universities had also examined David very carefully and discovered that there were no motor connections to the right side of his body. They had said to him, he has no sense of balance. He will never be able to swim or to skate or to ride a bicycle. On October the 23rd, 1971, my wife and I were in Winnipeg, Canada, to see little David Lofchik at his bar mitzvah. I wish you could have been there. I wish the television cameras of the world could have been there to see what we saw. That young boy, 13 years old, whom the doctors had said would never be able to walk or talk or count to 10, at that point in his life had already done as many as 1,100 push-ups in a single day, had run 6 miles non-stop, was doing extremely well as a 7th grader in 9th grade math at St. John's Ravenscourt School for Boys. He was running the wheels off his 3rd bicycle, was skating on the neighborhood hockey team, was one of the best table tennis players in the city of Winnipeg, Canada. The next year, to the best of my knowledge, he became the first, and so far as we know, the only victim of cerebral palsy to qualify for an unrated, ordinary $100,000 life insurance policy. The reason I share with you so many of the details of David's story is because it involves the principles that we've been talking about all the way through. First of all, there was the foundation, which is solid. They were absolutely honest with the Lofchiks, and the Lofchiks in turn were honest with David. Character is, as Calvert Roberts says, the ability to carry out a good resolution long after the excitement of the moment has passed. It's one thing to agree with the doctor, you're going to do this for the next 15 years. It's another thing to do it for the next 15 years. Integrity, no question, all the way from day one. Loyalty, you've never seen a family that were so one as the Lofchik family is. Trust, don't you know that the trust had to be incredible? 3 hours every single day. From then on in, David had to be in there working. Don't you know that when the doctor said there'll be years and years when you won't be able to see any change, that involved an incredible amount of trust? How many of us, for example, would have been willing to have hung in there all of that length of time? Love, one of the most beautiful love stories I think I've ever heard is this one. When David was about 2 years old, they had to start putting heavy leg braces on his legs every evening. And they had to make them progressively tighter. And every evening when Bernie and or Elaine would put those leg braces on, David would be there literally with tears in his eyes. And he had beautiful green eyes. He was a beautiful child. Cold black hair, olive complexion, with tears in his eyes, saying, "Mommy, do we have to put them on tonight? Or, Daddy, do you have to make them so tight?" Now, don't you know that any mother or father in existence would really have had trouble with that one? But Bernie and Elaine Lofchik loved David so much, they said no to the tears of the moment so they could say yes to the laughter of a lifetime. See, when you really love someone, you do for that person what is best for that person. Attitude every night when they were putting David to bed. First Elaine and then later Bernie. When he would come in every night, he would awaken David and he'd hold him in his arms. He'd say, "Son, you're a champ. You can do anything you want to do, son. And Dad really loves you and Mom really loves you." He was one of the first people to get a cassette recorder. In those days, they were just coming out. And every day while he was taking his therapy, he would be listening to the motivation while he was taking the therapy. Self-image, obviously, as a child, he could not have a good one as an infant, but today, of course, he does. Relationships, probably nobody has ever worked as closely with and in better cooperation with others than David Lofchik has been working all of his life. Goals, we talk about daily goals and long-range goals and big goals. David Lofchik had literally hourly goals on many occasions. Nobody has ever worked a minute harder than David Lofchik. Desire, when you start talking about desire, you're talking about a youngster who surpasses just about anybody in anything I've ever seen. The physical effort that went in all of this is absolutely astronomical. And David Lofchik, for 1 solid year, set his opportunity clock 1 hour earlier than any other member of the family. And when that clock would sound off, he'd get up and put his skates on, go out to that frozen swimming pool. And it took him 1 solid winter just to learn how to stand up on the ice. Later, he skated on the neighborhood hockey team. You've heard it said many times throughout the series that you can have everything in life you want if you'll just help enough other people get what they want. One of the interesting phenomena of this is that Bernie and Elaine Lofchik, in the process of providing David his opportunity in life, Bernie not only had to work smarter, but he also had to work harder. For 7 years, Bernie Lofchik worked 7 days and 7 nights every week. He took off 1 Friday night in 7 years in order to provide the financial necessities for giving his son everything he needed. Today, Bernie Lofchik is an extraordinarily wealthy man. But it goes beyond that. You see, they embrace the free enterprise system, but what effect does this have on other people? Let me share with you one of the other little interesting sidelines about the fact that we never really do go through life by ourselves. I was speaking out in Lubbock, Texas here several years ago, and I told David's story. There was a young couple seated in the very front, and as I told the story, they were visibly moved and asked for a visit privately when it was over. We visited, and they asked me the name of the doctor who had taken Dr. Pearlstein's place when Dr. Pearlstein retired. I gave them that doctor's name. That little girl, she was 18 months old. They flew her to Chicago for the examination because she had cerebral palsy. The doctor examined this little girl thoroughly. And when he finished the examination, he said, "This little girl does not have cerebral palsy. She simply was born prematurely. She's a little slow developing her. She's been misdiagnosed. But because you have been treating her as if she had cerebral palsy, she has acquired some of the symptoms of the disease. Take her back and treat her as a normal, healthy little girl, and you will end up having the normal, healthy little girl that you really want to have. It's quite a story, the David Lofchik story. It involves an awful lot of principles. It's not easy, but I think you'll agree that it's a story that we can learn from. Many, many times over the course of the years, I have thought to myself, I wonder how much bigger and faster and stronger and smarter, I wonder how much more David Lofchik would have been had he been given the same chance in life that you and I were given. Then finally one day, it hit me like a ton of bricks. Had he been given more, he undoubtedly would have ended up with less. Maybe a whole lot less. Maybe that's the reason God tells us in His book to thank Him for everything. Well, what's the end of the story? Well, the story's not ended. That's the reason we can't really end it, but I can bring you up to date. David Lofchik today is a handsome young man of 29 years of age. 195 pounds, a barrel for a chest. Happily married, a proud papa. And for the last 2 years, he's been the #1 condominium salesman in the #1 real estate firm in Winnipeg, Canada, having a marvelous time and a marvelous career. The principles he learned as a child are standing him in good stead now and will for the rest of his life. You see, it's not the story I'm really talking about. It's the principles that we're talking about. When you apply these principles, do these things and follow through on them, I can close as I always do by saying, if you'll do that, then I'll see you. And yes, I really do mean you at the top.
All right, that was truly amazing. And when I hear a story like that, I tend to feel a little guilty about things in my life I consider so difficult. But our trials and tribulations, they're our own, okay? It's what we deal with. So we shouldn't get discouraged when we hear amazing stories like this, because it's truly remarkable, and someone may hear your story and be just as inspired and hopefully motivated. So, well, that's it for this installment of the Selling for Life podcast. You can check out our website at sellingforlife.com. You can see more there on the amazing life of David Lofchik. You can also email us at contact@sellingforlife.com. So remember, whether you're a restaurant server trying to sell the house special, or you're trying to convince the manager of a restaurant in Florida you really are old enough to work, one thing is for sure, you are always selling for life.